Welcome to the Mojo Mundi podcast, where it's all about magic, manifesting, and movement. I'm Ginny Watts, the Dancing Witch, and this episode explores our relationship to death and endings. Death. How do we come to terms with it? How do we accept death? How do we face death? How do we prepare for death? How do we honor death? America has been labeled as having a death taboo. In her online column, Grief or Madness, thanatologist Cole Imperi asserts that ours is a taboo against grief, not death. I struggle to separate grief and death. I see them as intertwined, circumstance and reaction, each as a vital spiritual process, separate but connected. You may be asking yourself, why do we need to talk about unpleasant things? How does that create positive energy? Isn't it better to ignore the bad and focus on the good? I would like to suggest that insisting on the dichotomy of good and bad is a root of our problematic relationship with death and grief. But let's honor the resistance and see if we can soften our flight response to allow us to stay present in this exploration. When we feel the urge to ignore, that is a flight response to feeling unsafe. When we step into wanting an either-or answer, we are responding to a feeling of instability, which we equate with danger. The urge to focus on the positive and to avoid the unpleasant is a response to fear. So let's listen to the fear for a moment. What is frightening about death? About grief? It's easy to respond, what isn't frightening about death and grief? Let's not miss this opportunity. Let's at least begin the conversation by slowing down and really examining our fear. Death. Death is final. Death is absolute. Death is out of our control. Grief. Grief is painful. Grief is also not actually controllable. Grief and death are so much bigger than we are. Our brains are, first and foremost, focused on avoiding pain and death. Our survival instinct is ancient and necessary, and yet death and pain are inevitable and necessary elements of our existence. Equally important, death and pain are integral to our spiritual expansion and to manifesting. Death is one kind of ending. It is the ending of life in our current physical form. But the endings are happening ceaselessly in each and every day of our lives. As a therapist, a major issue for many of my clients revolved around an avoidance of endings. Whether it is a fear of one's own death, a fear of causing another's death, a fear of losing someone to someone else, an emotional death, a fear of losing one's friends, another emotional death, a fear of losing one's mind, a psychological death, a fear of losing one's job, a death of one's self-image. The fear is an attempt to control an ending that really isn't within control. Addiction can be seen as an attempt to avoid the ending of the pleasure that the drug of choice brings. Obsessions and compulsions, anxiety, depression, addictions are the natural byproducts of the attempt to control what is not ours to control. That is an attempt to control inevitable endings. And we experience the resistance to endings in much more subtle ways every day. When something doesn't go as I have planned, my anger response is always ultimately associated with a fear of failure or a fear of not getting something I need. Failure is an ending to a feeling of success, or at least of being okay. Not receiving is an ending of receiving. Absence is a cessation of presence. At least that's how the polarized brain sees things. One of the most interesting things I learned from my clients is that even when the ending is, quote, good, even when what is ending is unpleasant or harmful, even when something is ending so that we can move on to something we want more than what we are leaving behind, we often experience grief and pain and a feeling of loss. Every divorced individual who came into therapy with me, specifically to cope with the divorce, felt grief and loss, regardless of whether they were the one who initiated the divorce or they were the one who wanted to keep trying, regardless of whether they had been victimized by their spouse or they were the victimizer, regardless of whether they were divorcing in order to move into a new relationship or they were being left behind with no new person on the horizon. Wanted or not, divorce is an ending that invariably elicits grief at some level. This is a coincidentia oppositorum, a coming together of opposites, this feeling of wanting and not wanting simultaneously. And what about grief? Grief is pain. My clients also came into therapy in the hopes of relieving their current pain or avoiding some potential future pain. While we can cope with and even alleviate pain, we cannot create a pain-free life. Pain is inevitable. Pain is a part of being in a body. Pain is a part of being in relationship. Pain is part of knowing we exist. We can acknowledge that, clearly, it is reasonable to experience death and pain as unpleasant, undesirable, as antithetical to living and surviving. Of course, we don't want those we care about to die, to leave us, to not love us back. Of course, we want to avoid situations that can harm us. We can be compassionate with our fear and our avoidance. I invite you to take a moment to feel compassion for yourself and those around you as you recognize all the moments of fear and avoidance around pain and endings and lack of control. Let's not stop there, though, because there is a lot more to death and grief, to endings and pain, and to this concept of control. While we are fundamentally designed to make sure we survive by avoiding death and pain are also vital to the long-term survival of a species. Every living thing relies on the death of something else in order to survive. Death is necessary to allow for life to continue in a boundaried, that is, finite world, and the physical world is by definition finite or boundaried. Every living thing needs pain as a signal of guidance. Pain is contrast. Death and life, pain and comfort are deeply intertwined. Being alive is what brings us into awareness of death and pain. It is also what brings us into contact with every miracle that gives us our sense of joy and wonder. Being alive is what allows us to co-create. We can acknowledge that at the simplest level of the physical, of course we struggle with death and pain and develop so many thinking and feeling and behavioral habits in response to both. Let us also acknowledge that death and pain are an invitation to expand, to deepen our relationship with deity, to be mindful of how we spend our time and energy and creative potential. Here is another coincidentia oppositorum, the simultaneous existence of two seemingly mutually exclusive truths. Death and endings are a gift as well as a torment. When we are willing to allow something to end, whether that something is a relationship, a job, or a life, we are making way for something new to arise. Often we label that new something with a judgment, better or worse, wanted or unwanted, sacrifice or gift. The issue is not whether we should or shouldn't label, but rather the issue is around our short-sightedness. We view death in its momentary reality rather than as a transitory experience that is part of the greater cycle of birth, life, death, rebirth. We also see the new thing arising as a static object that will not change. When we can allow for endings to be a part of the flow rather than an isolated and unchanging event, we begin to connect with creator energy at a deep level. When we can experience the new as a birth, a transitory experience in the cycle, we have the opportunity to ride the exciting and joyous wave of inspired unfolding. The coincidentia oppositorum is my definition of magic. It is only by holding both truths, death as loss and death as invitation, that we get to experience magic. What is the invitation that death offers? There are so many answers to this question. The inevitability of our own ending invites us to be awake while we are alive. Death invites us into faith, into positing the realm of potential of what happens to the energy that is never created or destroyed, of what will be when our physical body becomes pure energy once again. Death invites us to embrace and be awake and attentive to our joy, our love, our wonder, right now as it happens. It is easy to take something for granted when we assume it will always be at hand. Death invites us to feel gratitude for what is now. In a similar way, pain also invites us to be present. Pain helps us stay safe. It also helps us take risks. Pain invites us into the process of balancing safety and risk. It lets us know what we do not want so that we may understand what we do want. It invites us to be aware of what we value. Pain is also an integral part of developing compassion, and it helps us understand what suffering is. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is not. Pain and death are at the heart of every existential crisis. They are integral elements to the initiation of every spiritual seeker. They are what calls forth manifesting, and they are the question for which allowing is the answer. Where does grief fit in here? Grief is a sacred span on the path through every spiritual transformation. It is an emotion. It is also a process. It is an important ingredient in the alchemy of temperance. Grief is the particular emotion of loss, and therefore it is present in varying degrees with every ending. Grief connects us with our humanness, our mortality, our body's transient nature. Death's invitations become powerfully meaningful when we allow ourselves to be awake and present to our grief. Grief is a particular pain that crosses our physical or earth vibration, our water or emotional vibration, our air or cognitive vibration, and the relational qualities of each. When we allow our grief to flow, we are actually harmonizing elemental energies in ourselves. Repressing, hiding, truncating, curtailing, and shaming grief are direct disruptions of a vital sacred process. At the same time, grief is a process, not an end in itself. Grief flows in and out of life. We are invited to allow grief to expand and transform us, and then to flow away as we move into the next leg of the journey as our newly tempered selves. When grief is expressed within the container of community, we can share the energy in a way that heals and expands both ourselves and those around us. On June 3rd of this year, The Eternal Song premiered, a documentary about the deep impacts of colonization on indigenous communities and their efforts to heal from intergenerational trauma through ancestral wisdom. The Eternal Song was released in conjunction with a week-long event to deepen and extend the impact of this moving masterpiece. On day 3 of the event, Maurizio and Zaya Bonazio, the film's co-directors and co-producers, hosted a conversation between Francis Weller and Orland Bishop focused on the sacred work of grief. Weller, a psychotherapist and soul activist, has a particular interest in the sacred work of grief. In this discussion, Weller makes a compelling argument for the power and importance of grief. He explains it this way. Grief is not here to take us hostage. Weller is alluding to a common fear that we will lose control if we step into grief. He identifies grief as a testament to and entwined with love. He goes on to say that he doesn't see prolonged grief as depression, but rather as oppression, the weight of compacted grief, undigested grief that is both our own and generational. Weller encourages us to shift our perception away from grief as a problem to be solved. Instead, he calls grief, quote, a presence awaiting witnessing. He tells us that when we witness grief, we warm it. When we warm our grief, it moves and evolves. When we approach our grief with coldness, it congeals and hardens and does not move. Weller identifies grief as communal, asserting that grief is not meant to be moved in isolation, but rather to be held in ritual. What a different message from what many of us get when we are grieving. How often are we urged subtly or aggressively to pull it together, move on, stop wallowing? How often do we admonish ourselves with such chilly scolding? And how often do we respond to others' expressions of concern and caring with assurances that we're okay? An equally chilling response to sharing our grief. How often do we shrink from reaching out to someone in grief because we feel our own fear and are hesitant to fail at such a critical juncture on behalf of our friend or loved one? Weller's antidote? He suggests we gather with friends and talk about grief. Have a gathering specifically to share our grief, to bring grief into our community with love and intention. Allow grief, death, and pain a rightful place in life. If we are willing to be present to whatever is, open to our own feelings, alert to the intricacies of circumstance, we may then allow what is. With the allowing, our experience educates us, softens us, challenges us, awakens us. Allowing keeps us tethered to both the present physical world and to the divine. The coincidentia oppositorum of mundane and divine simultaneity ignites magic. We flow with death and ending, even as we are flowing with life and beginnings. We experience pain and joy, each informing the other. If we want to shift our relationship to death and pain and grief, it may be helpful to start with small increments of revision. We may not have a choice. We may be suddenly and unexpectedly challenged to deal with a big death, a hardcore loss. But if we do have the chance to start smaller, I would suggest starting with changing one's view of the small deaths, the transient pains, the sisters of grief. Start today. We can be alert to endings throughout our day or week or both. We can recognize our irritation or procrastination or worry as fear. We can acknowledge, feel, maybe even share the small loss with others. Then we can experiment. We can take the time needed to truly validate the fear. And then, and only then, practice shifting toward allowing. I can feel and understand that this ending is difficult. I choose in this moment to consider that endings are part of the flow. Or, my old habit is to pull back from an ending. Today, I choose to be curious about what this ending is inviting me to experience or discover. Another circumstance that invites practice is disappointment. Disappointment is a sister of grief. We have multiple opportunities throughout our week to step into disappointment as an opportunity to experiment, gently, with a new relationship to grief. I feel the disappointment of missing the phone call from my friend. I feel disappointed because I love her and connecting with her is important. It actually feels good to recognize her importance to me. I feel both that I miss her and that I am grateful she is in my life. Allow for the simultaneity of these two incongruous feelings. Encounter the coincidentia oppositorum. I want to end with a personal experience. In October of 2002, my mother died suddenly and unexpectedly. She was in the hospital for surgery on a broken bone, the result of a fall. Despite her age, she was 82, we had no indication that she was in imminent danger of dying. I was in shock. It was after 10 at night when I headed in to meet my father at the hospital. The night was clear and crisp. The sky in our neighborhood was black and smooth, speckled and dusted with all the stars and the wide glowing band of the Milky Way. I was crying, had been crying. The crying was becoming a function of my body, going along like the expansion and contraction of my lungs or the beating of my heart. It was as if my body was functioning separately as my brain struggled to understand what was happening. I looked up through the windshield at the expanse of sky, and suddenly I pictured all these projects and tasks and hobbies my mother had waiting for her at home. It was all meaningless now. What she had considered a list of important things to do meant nothing without her. She was the reason they were important. They were meaningless in and of themselves. Oddly, in the midst of my shock and grief, even as I felt an unbearable and shattering loss, I also felt a clarity as pure as that night sky. I saw the meaninglessness of everything. Without her, all these events and plans and goals lost any significance. Simultaneously, I saw that her intentions were what gave it all meaning. Rather than feeling hopeless and bereft, I actually felt encouraged. I actually experienced a view from my observer self, a kind of expansion into a greater complexity, feeling the revelation as a deepening sensation in my body. Even as I observed the pointlessness that arose when my mother died, I simultaneously recognized in that moment that we are the point. We come into existence to bring meaning into existence. The fact that we take the meaning with us when we depart doesn't negate the significance, it just puts the significance where it belongs, on each of us. I didn't stop crying, though eventually the unceasing flow of grief began to resolve into periods of weeping. Over the days and weeks and years that followed my mother's death, I shared my grief with my husband and my children. I cry again as I speak in this moment about that night and my experience. I think my willingness to feel my grief, well, really my inability to avoid feeling my grief driving to the hospital the night she died, provided me with one of the most important experiences of my life. Death and endings help us understand our crucial purpose and role in life. We are here to co-create. We are here to bring meaning to creation. Together, everything that exists in this physical world creates a beautiful, vibrant weaving of import. Death does not punctuate our futility. Death illuminates our purpose, our substance, our essence. We bring meaning into the world, and we share meaning with everything in creation. As you explore how death, grief, and pain flow through your life, as you open to a sacred relationship with death, with pain and grief, your insights and wisdom will expand you and your world. I would be delighted to hear about your sacred path. Connect with me via my website or email or on Facebook at Caravan of Dreams MT. Our music is used by permission of the artist, Sean Phoenix. Thank you, Sean. And thank you to Bozeman Public Library for the Workbench Sound Studio located in beautiful downtown Bozeman, Montana. If you would like to learn more about allowing and how to find your unique style of manifesting, please visit my website, caravanofdreamsmt.com, or email me at dancingwitchmt@gmail.com. This is Ginny Watts, the Dancing Witch. Till next time, blessed be.